Let's hope that this works out. I'm going to add one additional complication of adding visual material to all this translation practices just to see how it works out. Owen, can you just let me know if this is working and if the slides are clear?
It is, yes.
All right, perfect. Thank you very much. All right, good evening, folks. Well, it's evening here and sitting in Hong Kong right now. My name is Nishant Shah. My pronouns are he and him. I am a professor of global media at the Chinese University of Hong Kong and a faculty associated with the Guggenheim Center for Intelligent Society at the Harvard University. And the director of the newly emerging digital narrative studio. I'm just mentioning all the three affiliations because the work I'm sharing with you today is work that I'm doing and collaborations between all of these three institutional spaces. My work and new experience are at the intersection of digital cultures, knowledge commons, gender and sexuality studies, and the questions of social and future justice. And it's a great pleasure, and it's been 3 years in the making to be invited to host this first keynote of the Queering Media Conference, and the privilege to be able to talk to a community that's, I don't know, one of the most diverse, critical, and open, as well as among the longest prevailing and persistent communities online. And as a keynote speaker, I have the privilege to not speak about the present, but about the future, and particularly in the context of artificial intelligence-driven futures that almost all of our digital communities are informed by, it's perhaps important to start thinking about the relationship between AI and queerness. So I will begin with a particular case from 2017.
Let's see if this is better. Okay. You didn't miss anything in the beginning. I was just introducing myself and talking about what my affiliations are. But we can begin I just wanted to say that as a keynote speaker, I have the privilege not to speak about the present, but about the future. And particularly in the context of artificial intelligence-driven future that almost all our digital communities are informed by, it's important to perhaps think about the relationships between AI and queerness. And I'll begin talking about AI and queerness and then connect it to the challenges that it offers to communities like the Wikipedia community, beginning with a particular case that dates back to 2017. Because it did become a focus point of conversations around AI, gender, and sexuality online. So in their very much reviled and heavily criticized experiment at Stanford University, machine learning and data scientists Mikhail Kosinski and Yulun Wong created a sexual orientation detector, right? So they trained a machine learning algorithm on 35,326 images from public profiles on a US dating website to create composite faces using an aggregate of images from self-identified straight, gay, or lesbian profiles. And they claim that their algorithm can now detect people's sexuality by looking at their faces with more accuracy than human beings. Their academic article was kind of less ambitious and said that when compared to a data set of human detectors inferring sexuality, their algorithms were 81% more effective. So, right, not 81% true, but 81% more effective at distinguishing between gay and straight men, and 74% for the time for women. So several authoritative voices from data science who know more than I do have now debunked this experiment, questioned its validity, and proven that not only was the experiment radically flawed, but that it was fundamentally informed by queer phobia and heteronormative biases. Right? So the work of the Human Rights Campaign, GLAAD, scientists like Blaise Aguilera, Alexandra Todorov, Margaret Mitchell, have shown how science in this particular instance was being used to perpetuate violence in this study. Now, my job is not to figure out whether this study was accurate enough or not, right? I mean, even while this was happening, for example, the Chinese government announced that they have trained a facial recognition algorithm to predict with 90% accuracy whether someone was a convicted criminal, and also the same algorithms were being used for queer detection. But as Sarah Myers-West, Meredith Whitaker, and Kate Crawford have pointed out in their extremely well-considered report on discriminating systems, predictive AI is not just flawed in its prediction, but wrong in its very existence. Right? This is my point of departure for us today. That we understand that these technologies of detection and outing are not to be judged based on whether they are accurate or not, or how accurate they are. That we need to recognize these technologies as darkly continuing traditions of race science, and in particular, the debunked fields of phrenology, which were trying to derive character traits from skull shape and often used by white supremacists in 19th century America, and continuing to be used by white supremacists even now. So my talk today then is to understand the context that allows for these kinds of AI weaponizations to happen, and the kind of cultures of knowledge production that support the making and naturalization of these kinds of detection and outing AIs, right? Or in other words, what are the kinds of social, political, and cultural imaginations and presumptions that make it possible for these kinds of outing technologies to emerge? The first, and this is perhaps, I don't know, the most evident to all of us who are invested in knowledge production. Well, the first presumption is that technologies and the knowledge they produce is neutral, right? So the claim of objectivity and neutrality allow for scientists like Kaczynski and Wong to insist that their models of AI are merely describing a reality and that they have no ethical and political responsibility for this description. It is the same confidence in neutrality of technology or even the neutrality of knowledge production, which looks at the brokenness of the world and takes it as natural. They look at conditions of injustice or discrimination or violence and abuse, and in describing and codifying them, reinforce them and hurt the vulnerable, all the while emphasizing that they are merely describing a feature rather than questioning why they need to describe this feature at all. Or in other words, to presume that technology is neutral allows them to weaponize, and once weaponized, to distance themselves from the consequences of it. This also means that when thinking through the relationship between artificial intelligence and queerness, for instance, the claim is often made that AI is neutral, and if it harms queer people, it's because the queer people are worthy of harm. Because if the world did not want to harm queer people, then the AI would not do it anyway. This is an active fallacy, which separates AI from queerness and then turns a blind eye to the ways in which queerness is actually critical and central to the formations of these kinds of predictive technologies, because it is always used as something that is dirty, contaminated, or in need of detection. Right? So the first idea is that we need to understand that specific kinds of technologies, but particularly AI detection technologies, actually resort to and produce the queer as essentially dirty or contaminated. And hence they are there to kind of gentrify and clean the systems of queernesses of different kinds. The second principle that informs this detective AIs is the long-standing history between queerness and technologies of outing. The idea of outing is in competition with the concept of coming out, right? So while coming out in so many different communities is an act of agency, empowerment, self-identification, putting the queer person in control of their narrative and practice, outing replaces the individual's own choices and makes them vulnerable by assigning public gender and sexual identity without the person's information and definitely without their consent. So this is not new. Various technological histories of outing exist. Gregory Manson summarizes this powerfully when he writes, and I'm just reading from the slide here, 19th century measurement of lesbians' clitorises and homosexual men's hips, to late 20th century claims to have discovered gay genes, gay brains, gay ring fingers, lesbian ears, and gay scalp hair, have all been ways by which historical technologies have been used to dehumanize and persecute sexual minorities under a scientific pretext. So the queer across these histories is not something that the technology is out, but it is in fact a category that technologies use in order to create the baseline and the normal, right? So the queerness then is not an outside of technology, but these technologies of meaning making use the meaning of queer to define the norm. The queer is not on the margins, but at the center of its attention because everybody is presumed straight. And then straightness no longer needs to be measured, and there is no need for these predictive technologies. So predictive AI needs and defines and creates outliers. And when it comes to gender and sexuality, these technologies use the queer identity to train their data sets, but more importantly, justify their presence by attributing dirt, risk, and danger to these queer bodies. Take the recent monkeypox virus spread in 2022. So we were all, barely recovering from the aftermath of COVID-19. And then there was this increased alarm about the rise of new viruses. So when the monkeypox incidence rate started rising, it was evidently garnering a lot of media and public attention. And while there was no scientific evidence or data that the virus was affecting or spreading with more frequency among gay men than straight men, gay men were immediately marked as high-risk populations. Not because of the frequency of spread, but because of the frequency of reporting. It's important to realize, as Alexandra Yuas points out, that sexual health education in a post-HIV world is highest amongst gay men. And hence they started reporting and monitoring their individual and collective health with more alertness than any other similar demography. However, their reporting was immediately misread as them being dirty or risky. They were considered to be potential contaminants, dangerous, and targeted for treatment, education, control, monitoring, surveillance, and risk management. Monkeypox actually got labeled as a gay virus, and healthcare predictive models and AI started creating models of contagion targeting, which was targeting gay men, creating them as dirty, and using platforms, queer dating platforms like Grindr, to subject them to extreme surveillance and experimentation in the name of controlling and managing public health. And the third presumption that I want to share with you about what makes these weaponizations of AI technologies possible is the idea that these weaponized technologies exist because of the narrative strategies that we use to describe human beings and technologies in this human technology interaction, right? Because one of the keenest, perhaps, promises and the biggest myth of digital technologies is cleanliness. There is a continued insistence of how digital technologies are clean and reliable and designed to avoid unwanted contamination. Right? And particularly with artificial intelligence, which is also seen as an evolution of legacy digital systems of computational networks, this rhetoric is strongly present. And you see it in many different ways, like AI for social good or AI for fairness. Because in conceptualizing AI as a solution to problems of inequity or as a driver of social good, what we essentially get is the idea or the story of the human as both creating the problems as well as unable to work towards the social good. For AI to be the cleansing agent, the human then has to be dirty, right? And it's only when we produce the model of the human as unreliable, incompetent, corruptible, or fragile that we can rely upon the notion of AI as fast, predictable, immutable, and robust. The operations of this clean AI thus start naturalizing the idea that the human in itself is dirty and needs constant interventions. And so strong is this narrative that no amount of empirical or anecdotal evidence shifts this idea of flawed AI. So, for example, when trans drivers are locked out, trans drivers who are working for Uber are locked out of the system because facial recognition softwares do not account for transitioning faces, it is the human which is considered unreliable and mutable. For a lot of us who have been following conversations around AI, we know about the stories that came out from the head of Google AI, Timnit Gebru. And Gebru had particularly mentioned that large language models which are trained on texts from the internet, amplify risk towards racially and sexually marked bodies by subjecting them to abusive language. Her questioning of the cleanliness of AI was literally silenced by the teams from Google, and the direction was very clear that we can question the deployment of AI technologies and have oversight about the harms that they cause, but we don't question the fundamental proposition that AI technologies are clean and will always be needed to clean the dirty human. So if these are the foundational problems of AI mechanics, deployment, and evaluation, if the queer will always have to be produced as dirty to justify the use of AI technologies, it brings us up to the question of what will the communities in Wikipedia do? Because on the one hand, there is an increased integration of AI chatbots, decision-making processes, and predictive models which make knowledge production faster, more streamlined, and easier. And on the other is the undeniable fact that AI technologies keep on producing certain communities, like queer communities, as dirty and hence constantly in need of cleaning and purging. Now, there are some easy answers which are often given to these concerns about queer futures as shaped by these AI technologies, right? So people point out that we need to increase the diversity of training data, or that we need to curate algorithms towards inclusive networking, or that we put checks and balances on the computational networks in order to keep queer people safe. And while all of these are important safeguards, let's be clear that these are post-facto implementations that mitigate the effects of harm rather than diminishing the violence against the queer bodies, which I am proposing is structurally built into artificial intelligence platforms and practices. One of my favorite ways of understanding this is that a correction of how AI is deployed and what its intention in a community is perhaps as futile as trying to de-weaponize a gun after spreading it around in society. Right? So when we are thinking about queering AI and how these now AI deployments are going to be introduced into communities of knowledge production like Wikipedia, we perhaps need to think about new structures and foundational changes that we will need to integrate AI that does not treat the queer as dirty or in need of cleaning. And I have three speculative and material propositions today which help us break away from the clean AI, dirty queer narrative deadlock and demand the abandoning of some core technological practices of AI in order to serve the needs of queer life and safety. And these propositions are by no means exhaustive, but they kind of indicate the challenges that communities like Wikipedia will face in queering the platform. So my first proposition is to refuse the individuation of the node. So at the heart of digital computation is the construction of nodes in a network, right? So nodes do not have a linear comprehensive origin story that pre-exists the network intentions of circulation. In fact, in the Barabashi-Alberto model of understanding scale-free networks, we see that nodes do not have a value or an origin of their own, but that they accrue value through connecting with other nodes. In their preferential attachment theory, they argue that the more a node is connected in a network, the more likely it is to receive new links, right? And in social theory, this is often dubbed as the Matthew effect, or in common sense, it's called the rich get richer effect. Now, most AI work with this preferential attachment theory for their growth, establishing a positive feedback cycle between the node that is already in power and those who link back to it, which means that AI networks have a clear idea of independent and discrete and isolated nodes, which will be favored both in terms of amplification of their information value. Right? So scale-free networks, and Wikipedia is an example of a scale-free network, constantly judge some nodes as pure and some as contaminated based on their capacity to scale and circulate. Contemporary AI deployments thus treat certain nodes as nodes which need to be either dismissed or in fact quarantined and then cleaned. My first proposition for us tonight is to reject this as the only viable model of AI deployment. We need to start thinking about other ways when nodes are not isolated or treated as invaluable only through their circulation capacities. That by rejecting the node as something that is individual, by rejecting the idea that the node can be removed or controlled, we call for a more diffuse set of information that treats the community or the collective as a unit of knowledge production. Thus, the AI is not a cleansing agent that marks some nodes as dirty, but in fact a delegation agent that puts the decision-making back on the community that owns and produces this knowledge. My second proposition for us to think through, and again, as you will realize, this is drawing from some of the core values of Wikipedia itself. My second proposition for us is to, in fact, lean into fragmentation and omission. The algorithmic violence of detection depends upon the promise of intelligibility, right? Only that which can be fully known is considered to be clean. To an algorithm that is trained to detect queerness, all appearances without context can appear queer. The presumption that AI can and will know everything about us needs to be radically challenged. We have to understand that even as AI is presented as descriptive, it is a prescriptive model of the world. And in this, AI keeps on justifying its errors and problems by claiming that we do not have to make AI fairer and better decision-making processes need to be put into place. Instead, what we do is we put the queer nodes under extreme surveillance and demanding that they become more intelligible, produce more data, which will still only be filtered by the intentions of AI, which continue to be queer-phobic. And we now need to think about this new way in which we resist the demands of AI to make ourselves completely transparent. As a longtime student of Wikipedia communities, I think one of the strengths of Wikipedia knowledge production is to know that we will never know everything, that there will always be omission, there will always be fragments, there will always be knowledge which we cannot represent, not consume, and not describe. I think that is a queer strategy. Drawing inspiration from Zach Blas, who's one of my favorite artists, like he made this facial recognition mask. We have to lean into the practices of obfuscation and reticence, not demanding that all the users produce themselves to the demands of AI management, but asking AI systems to be accountable in their fragmented decision-making when faced with incomplete or flawed data sets. That we need to stop being apologetic for absence of information and instead see absence or silence as a queer strategy by which AI scrutiny can be revised and resisted. And my third proposition for us is to perhaps recognize that contamination is joyful. Of course, there is pathology in it, but there is also the sense of risk and frisson and vulnerability which needs to be celebrated. We also need to understand that we need to change the narratives of AI as clean, because the myth of innocence of AI is countered by multiple examples and experiences, right? So if you look at the circuits of media manipulation, information shaping, misinformation, targeted and automated attacks against queer people, profiling and discrimination, you can just produce a litany of the ways in which AI is not pure or clean, and that in fact it requires a whole range of governance system in order to control it. We know that AI, right, so both generic and generative, are guided by technological and political impulses that continue to skew them towards populist attitudes and approaches. And yet we keep on thinking of AI failures as mere errors which needs to be corrected, largely at the expense of the human. So instead, we need to perhaps admit and keep on insisting that AI is dirty. It is dirty in its very origins, both technological networking as well as in its social deployment. And that we refuse to delegate the responsibilities of cleanliness and management to these self-learning systems. Instead, we start producing narratives and highlight the unreliability and the shaky nature of AI and create new relationships where we do not measure one AI with another. Instead, we put human collectives as the measure of artificial intelligence. And when in conflict, we resist the weaponization of AI against the human, which generally takes the route of better data, more data, and we now instead start pulling out of the systems and find alternative modes of decision and meaning making. I think these are exciting challenges for the future of Wikipedia communities as they start deploying AI more in the systems. And given the huge central focus on community, collectivity, and human capacity for meaning making, this perhaps looks precisely like the community that will be able to show the way forward for queering the internet to create kinships of queer solidarity that perhaps infect the digital futures with, a joyful possibility. So those were just my few reflections for today. I think it's a good time to perhaps take a pause, listen to how other people are feeling about it. If I'm not very clear about something, please feel free to ask questions, and I can maybe explain a little bit more about where my research is coming from and why I'm presenting this to you. But I'll stop here and thank you very much for your patient listening.
Thank you very much, Nishant. It was a pleasure to hear you as always, and I think it was both insightful and maybe inspirational for the way to think of our own practices in a different way. I think in Wikimedia movement there is a lot of maybe even panic that our data is being used extensively in training language models, and corporations have little understanding of the global dynamics of communal work, of what gets covered or it doesn't. So there is kind of implicit fear that this will be abused both for commercial interests, but also not understood in a way that Wikimedians understand that there are gaps and they are especially prominent in some fields. With Wikipedia, maybe there is also a big generational gap. I think the early Wikipedians were aspirational to capture the whole human knowledge, and they saw this as a horizon that they could achieve. It was maybe not as indefinite as we see it now. It was something that had maybe a modernist idea of a single neutral perspective and possibility to map all the knowledge. Now that we discuss so many different types of experiences, so many different types of contexts and knowledge embedded in those contexts, we don't make those assumptions as easily. Maybe to return a little bit back to this notion of a kind of dirty and clean in technology, I was personally very enthusiastic about discussing how technology is not neutral, and for technologists to accept this, it was taking a lot of time, more often than not. And for them to accept that technology might be even dirty could be even more radical proposal. And it will remain dirty, at least as much as we are, if not worse. Can you see maybe good examples in where this is explicit, where it's discussed, and there is kind of positive movement in understanding how neutrality is no longer taken for granted, and maybe this filth and this problematic human dirt and mistakes and queerness can find space?
Thank you. I think that's a very helpful set of reflections following this small input. For me, as somebody who studies kind of more ontologies of digital computation networks, I am particularly fascinated by the framing of clean technologies, specifically because we know that in its very digital computation, technology is promiscuous, right? One of my favorite examples is, I don't know where, of course, people are coming in from all different countries. So please do this experiment only after checking if this is allowed in your country or not. But in large parts of the world, you will be allowed to install something called a packet sniffer on your machine, right? So it basically is a very harmless kind of a software which monitors and visualizes all the traffic that is going through your laptop at any given moment when it's connected to a network. Now, if you install a packet sniffer and then if you do absolutely nothing on your laptop, you will suddenly realize that even while you are not doing anything, your laptop seems to be talking to a whole bunch of other devices and continuously exchanging data. I mean, of course, a lot of this is very harmless, right? It's just updates that it is doing to different systems. It is pinging itself regularly to the central server, recognizing itself. It is perhaps transferring data from one point to the other because that is in the background running and so on. But it's also interesting to realize that if your laptop is basically part of a digital network which is trying to maximize resources and minimize redundancy, then somebody else who is using that network for a high computational process task might actually be routing information through your laptop. That sounds like a very, very technical and complex way of saying that if we were all connected in the same, let's say, Wi-Fi network, and I was downloading material on my computer which was objectionable, there is a chance that that material might in fact be passing through your network and through your laptops before it reaches mine, right? Digital networks bleed all the time. They are insanely promiscuous in the ways in which they connect different devices and contaminate each other with different kinds of informational traces. So if we know that at the very technological level, networks are so contaminated and promiscuous, why do we keep on reproducing them as clean is the question. And so that's like the one framing of the argument. And then the second one, as I already briefly kind of gestured, just look at the last 10 years of what AI and self-learning algorithms have done. And we have realized that they are extremely volatile, that they are in need of huge amounts of oversight and surveillance, that they intentionally and unintentionally produce conditions of harm and abuse, and we still keep on relying upon them as more robust and more predictable and more reliant than the human beings that we at least ontologically know, because we also are at least partially human, right? So I'm very fascinated by these narratives which are being presented of these technologies as infallible, technologies which are supposed to help with the cleaning, technologies which are supposed to help govern, because in all of that is the foundational idea that there is risk and then there is dirt. And then the risk and the dirt is always a human attribute. And that the technology with all of its sins is going to be accepted into this fold because it's the best way of efficient cleansing of these communities. So I really like some of the work that is coming up from queer art right now, because so much of it is not just about resisting and finding a better deployment of it, but actually saying, let's foundationally change what AI can do. Right? So if we want to work with biometrics, facial recognition, artificial intelligence systems, and questions of sexuality, let's not help improve those systems. Let's actually start recreating new forms of what is data, what is information, how will it be filtered, who's going to make meaning out of it. And again, I think that there are very few human-driven communities online which can actually take this challenge up. Right? Saying how do we produce information and meaning so that it is still guided by sources, citations, knowledge, facts, truths, experiences, and how do we then also continue to not just lean into this idea that all our information will be made better sense of by using an AI deployment. I mean, that was like basically where I was standing.